We're back in the airway and breathing course going over some key material, fundamental material here. We've talked about oxygenation. Now we're going to talk about ventilation before we move on to some airway anatomy things. Ventilation is the brother of oxygenation. Both of them need to be intact and operating in order for your patient to be living like they should. And the basic concept with ventilation, as flippant as it sounds, is good air in and bad air out. Now, if we have to choose between oxygenating and ventilating, we'll choose oxygenating. Patients must have oxygen. Their brain needs a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. It can't store either of those, so it needs to be a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. But the way that the oxygen is brought in, for the most part, is ventilation. So we want to get some good air in, get the bad air out, and there's a couple of terms with ventilation that we get into now. In many textbooks, they go into functional residual capacity and all kinds of other stuff. That's nice, that's R-rated. The G and PG stuff that you must know is the definition of the term minute volume. And minute volume is simply the amount of air that you move in and out of your lungs in a minute. The amount of air you move in and out with each breath is called the tidal volume. And if you were to take the tidal volume and multiply it by the number of breaths per minute, the breathing rate, now you get minute volume. So it seems very elementary, but we think it's fundamental stuff, and I wanted to make sure that we talked about those terms early on here. The other basic concept is this thing about the pulmonary tree, and that you must have an intact chest and pleural system. If you think of the pulmonary tree, the respiratory system, with the trachea, the main bronchi, and then the various branching bronchi, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually you have the alveoli at the end, the leaves on the tree. This whole thing looks like an upside down tree. And the key concept being there that we need to ventilate that whole tree, because oxygenation occurs at the leaves on the tree, not the trunk, not the trachea. We need to get oxygen down, ventilate it down all the way to the alveoli. The other thing is that the mechanics have to be intact. We're negative pressure breathing animals, and so if we don't have an intact chest wall, the chest is not able to move up and down and create that negative pressure in order for us to bring air in, then our patients aren't going to do as well. And then the last piece of this is the concept of the pleura. You have a parietal pleura and a visceral pleura. Those are the linings around the inside of your chest wall, the parietal pleura, and the visceral pleura, the lining around the outside of your lung. And those two pleura should be stuck together through adhesion. There's a small amount of pleural fluid in there that keeps them stuck together. They should not be separated. The pleural space should not have anything in it but a small amount of fluid. There should not be air in it. That's a pneumothorax. There should not be blood in it. That's a hemothorax. So this intact chest wall that can expand, create negative pressure. As it expands, it pulls the lungs to open. That negative pressure allows the lungs to fill with air to ventilate. Good air in, bad air out. We can measure ventilation with capnography. We measure oxygenation with pulse oximetry. We measure ventilation with capnography. Oxygenation and ventilation are two separate processes. Capnography tells you nothing about oxygenation, but it does tell you about ventilation as long as a couple of other conditions are in place. And we mentioned before in the oxygenation lesson, you can't make a valid decision if you've got invalid data. So we need to make sure that we understand what we're getting with capnography. Capnography measures the amount of carbon dioxide that is exhaled from the lungs. So where does carbon dioxide come from in the body? Well, carbon dioxide is the byproduct of metabolism at the cellular level. The cells use oxygen and glucose, and they make energy, and it gives off a waste gas of CO2. So CO2 is made in the cells during metabolism. Perfusion, circulation, delivers it back to the lungs, and then ventilation exhales it. If your metabolism is functioning normally, and your perfusion is functioning normally, then the capnography is a measure of how well you're ventilating. But if you're not metabolizing, not making any CO2, then your capnography reading is not going to really reflect ventilation because metabolism is messed up. If you have very low perfusion, and your capnography is going to be not necessarily reflecting ventilation. So if metabolism is intact, CO2 is being made, perfusion is intact, CO2 is being brought back to the lungs, then we can look at our capnography number and see how we're ventilating. As your ventilatory rate goes up, your capnography reading will go down. As your capnography reading, if it's rising, then that would indicate that you're hypoventilating. So as your ventilations go down, ventilatory rate and depth go down, then that tends to give you a higher capnography reading. There's a pretty good lesson inside your Moodle about capnography, but I wanted to hit these major points here up front. So again, fundamental stuff, good air in, bad air out. Capnography measures ventilation as long as metabolism and perfusion are normal. And capnography has nothing to do with measuring oxygenation.